before the story begins. She had no medals, no combat record, no reputation worth mentioning. Just a rifle, a ridgeline, and one shot that nobody believed was possible. They called her a desk soldier, a communications filler, dead weight in boots. Then the ambush hit, and every single man who laughed at her suddenly needed her to survive it. But the shot that saved them wasn't the mystery. The mystery was the file someone had buried, the rank someone had stripped, the name someone had tried to erase from military history entirely. And the question nobody was asking yet: why had she been sent here in the first place? If this story already has you locked in, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go. The transport helicopter set down at Fort Blackridge just after 340, and nobody bothered to meet it. That was the first thing Elena Vale noticed. At every other post she'd been assigned to over the past 6 years, there was always someone waiting, a duty officer with a clipboard, an NCO who'd been voluntold, a private who'd lost whatever game the platoon was playing that night. The Army ran on protocol. Protocol meant someone standing in the cold with a manifest and an expression that said they'd rather be anywhere else. Fort Blackridge ran on something different. She stepped off the bird with her ruck over one shoulder and her rifle case in her offhand, boots hitting Afghan dirt for the first time in nearly 3 years. The rotors were already spooling back up before she'd cleared the landing zone. She turned once, and the helicopter was already gone, taking its noise and its light, with it leaving her standing alone at the edge of a forward operating base that looked like it had been punched in the face repeatedly and had simply decided to keep standing out of stubbornness. The walls were HESCO barrier and sandbag, 12 feet in most places, patched with timber and scrap metal where the original construction had failed or been hit. Guard towers at each corner, their floodlights cutting slow arcs across the outer wire. A generator somewhere behind the main building was grinding with the sound of a machine that had given up on efficiency and was now operating purely on refusal. The air smelled like dust, diesel, and underneath both of those, something burned wood, or maybe fabric recent enough that the smell hadn't fully settled into the base yet. Elena stood still for a moment and breathed it in. Something burned here in the last 48 hours. She filed that away without deciding what to do with it yet. She found the duty office on her own. The corporal behind the desk looked up from his phone with the expression of a man interrupted mid-sentence in a conversation far more important than his actual job. Specialist Vale? That's right. He looked at her the kind of look that ran a quick inventory and came back unsatisfied. No unit patch on her shoulder yet. No combat badge on her chest. Thin frame, plain face, hair pulled back so tight it looked almost painful. She was 31 and could pass for 24 in bad light, which she'd been told repeatedly, like it was a flaw she ought to fix. You're the comms transfer. I'm the signals specialist. Yes, right. He went back to his screen. Sergeant Shaw runs your platoon. He'll square you away in the morning. Female quarters, second building on the left. Bunk 7. Who's the duty officer tonight? Lieutenant Hale. He's doing rounds. I'll find him. It's 400, specialist. I know what time it is. He looked up, again, a fraction more careful this time. Sergeant Shaw, he repeated. In the morning. That's all you need right now. She picked up her rifle case and left without thanking him. She slept 90 minutes. That was standard for her. In a new place, her body refused to fully disengage until it had mapped the geometry of the environment and filed it somewhere it could access quickly. She spent those 90 minutes learning the sounds of the base, the generator's particular rhythm, the rotation timing of the perimeter guards, based on when the footsteps passed the exterior wall of her bunk room, the distant nothing of the dark desert beyond the wire. At 530, she was up, stretching in the narrow space between her bunk and the wall. At 545, she'd cleaned her rifle in complete darkness, by touch, in just under 4 minutes. She ate a protein bar and drank half a liter of water and watched the eastern sky through the room's single small window turn from black to purple to the washed out gray that passed for dawn in this part of the world. Fort Blackridge. 58 personnel on the current manifest. She'd verified that from the board she'd passed in the duty office. Mixed role unit infantry, support, and a signals element, which was nominally why she was here. The previous signals specialist had been medivist with a hand injury 2 weeks prior. She was the replacement. That part was technically true. It wasn't the whole story. She knew this because the request for her specific EMOS code had been routed through 2 separate command levels before landing on her CO's desk in Kandahar, and routine replacement requests at small FOBs didn't travel that way. They went through 1 level, got approved or denied, and moved on. 2 levels meant someone above normal authorization had signed off, or had influenced someone who had. She didn't know yet who that was, but she'd been turning it over since she'd first seen the reassignment order, and it had the texture of something deliberate. She chose not to ask. Asking questions about the mechanics of your own orders was the fastest way to end up somewhere that made this place look comfortable. Sergeant Derek Shaw was exactly what she expected, and nothing she'd underestimated. He was built like a man who had been tested repeatedly and had passed each time through sheer refusal rather than grace broad through the chest and shoulder, with a jaw that had been repaired at some point along a lateral fracture, the scar tissue running faint along his left side. He moved through the FOB the way a person moves through a place they've owned for years. Not ownership by rank, but by presence. Every soldier they passed acknowledged him differently than they acknowledged the officers. Less formal, more instinctive. He looked at her the same way the corporal had. Same inventory, same conclusion. Vale. Sergeant, you've done country before. 3 tours, 2 in Kandahar, 1 in Kunar. He considered that. Combat? She let a beat pass. Just 1. Support roles, mostly. He accepted it without pressing, which told her he hadn't looked at her full file yet. If he had, that single word mostly would have prompted a different conversation entirely. Comms tent is past the motor pool, 2nd building. Corporal Riggs runs it. He'll get you oriented on the equipment and the patrol frequencies. Patrol schedule posts at 1,800. You're not on rotation the first week. I'd like to go out sooner. He studied her. Why? If I'm running radio support for patrols, I need to know what the terrain actually looks like. Maps in this region are 2 years behind the ground truth. I can do better work if I've seen it. It was a reasonable answer. It was also true. It just wasn't the complete truth, but first conversations rarely required that. We'll see, Shaw said. Stay out of trouble, and I'll think about it. He walked away. She watched the slight hitch in his right knee old injury, managed but not healed. He'd be slower on loose shale than his bearing suggested. She filed that and moved on. Private First Class Danny Okafor brought her a mug of coffee in the comms tent on her second morning and sat on an equipment crate with the casual confidence of someone who had decided she was probably fine. He was 22, gap-toothed, and funny, the way young soldiers sometimes were genuinely, without effort, which also meant he said things before he'd thought them through. No offense intended, he said, but what exactly are they doing, sending us a desk soldier? What makes you think I'm a desk soldier? He gestured at her vaguely, inclusively, at all of her. You've got a look. What look? Like you read a lot. And you iron your uniform. Nobody irons their uniform out here. I don't iron my uniform. The fold is from packing. See, even knowing that is a desk thing to know. Elena looked at him for a long moment. I also shoot at a level most people in this phobie couldn't qualify for. He laughed, assuming it was a joke. She didn't correct him. She let him go on thinking it because people who thought she was joking didn't adjust their behavior around her and that was useful. She spent the rest of that morning learning the comms equipment. It took her 2 hours to cover what Riggs had estimated would take most of the day, which made Riggs uncomfortable, in the specific way that competent people make others uncomfortable when they move faster than expected. The equipment was mostly standard issue. Mostly. She found 2 modifications she didn't recognize from the current spec sheet added hardware, not factory installation, installed recently based on the mounting bracket condition. She wrote the serial numbers in the small notebook she kept in her left breast pocket and photographed both units with her personal camera. Those were in the resupply 3 weeks back, Riggs said, watching her. They're not in the equipment manifest. I figured they were just logged under a difference. They're not logged at all. She set the camera down and looked at him directly. Who signed for the resupply? Riggs shifted his weight. Sergeant Kellerman, I think. Or it might have been, actually. I'm not sure. There was a lot coming in that day. Okay. I can ask. Don't mention it yet. I'll follow up through the right channel. She didn't follow up immediately. She wanted to watch for a while first. Quiet observation. Before conclusions, it was that had cost her life more than once, and had cost her a career at least once, so she had complicated feelings about it. But she couldn't turn it off any more than she could turn off breathing. On day 4, she asked Shaw again about the patrol. He said no. Day 6, she asked again. And he stopped walking and turned to look at her with an expression halfway between irritation and something that might have been respect if she'd caught it in better light. You're pushy for someone who just got here. I know what I need to do my job. Going outside the wire is part of it. Your job is radio. My job is making sure every person on patrol can communicate under pressure. I can't do that properly from in here. And there's no other reason. She held his eyes. I need to see the terrain, Sergeant. That's my reason. He studied her for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. Then, day after tomorrow, Eastern Ridge Patrol. You carry your own weight, you stay in your lane, you don't freelance. First sign of trouble, you get behind cover, and you stay there. Understood? Understood. And Vale. He waited until she looked at him. You're in my platoon now. That means I'm responsible for you coming back. Don't make that harder than it needs to be. She nodded once and didn't add anything to it. The patrol formed up at 620 on Thursday. 7 soldiers total, Shaw at rear, Lieutenant Marcus Hale at point, Torres and Jennings in the middle positions, Elena walking third from the front with Corporal Webb, just ahead. Hale was young 27 maybe, with the precise posture of someone whose entire professional life had been evaluated on correctness. West Point, she guessed, or very close to it. He'd glanced at her during the pre-patrol brief, the way officers glanced at soldiers they'd already categorized and moved past. He hadn't spoken to her directly. That was fine. She wasn't there to be spoken to. The route took them east along a dry riverbed for approximately 2 kilometers, then up onto the ridgeline that overlooked connecting to the primary terrain feature, the maps labeled as Hill 1142. The riverbed was broad and flat and offered almost no cover, which was a tactical problem someone had apparently decided was acceptable. The ridgeline above it offered good observation in 3 directions, and was the obvious high ground for anyone who wanted to watch the FOB's eastern approaches without being seen from the walls. Elena noted that the patrol route had been run, according to the schedule board, on the same general line for the past 3 weeks. Same time window, same direction, same rough terrain profile. That was a pattern. Patterns were problems. She walked and watched and said nothing. At the 40-minute mark, the birds went quiet. Not gradually, suddenly, the way birds went quiet when something that wasn't human movement happened nearby. She'd learned that distinction over years in several environments, and it wasn't something she could fully articulate, but it was something she completely trusted. She slowed her pace by a half step and scanned the high ground without moving her head more than a few degrees in either direction. The western slope clear, the ridgeline above them to the north, clear. The southern exposure, running away from the FOB direction. 3 natural firing positions, 2 obvious. One disguised by a rock fold that required lying prone at an uncomfortable angle for a shooter, but offered a clean sight line down into the valley floor. No movement. But the shadow in the rock fold was wrong. Shadows tracked with sun angle. This one was running slightly counter to where it should have been if it were cast by the rock itself. The margin was small, maybe 8 degrees off, and you'd have to know exactly where the sun was relative to the terrain feature and have enough spatial reference to notice the discrepancy. She noticed. She stopped walking. Someone is watching us. Torres turned. Jennings half turned. Shaw was already moving forward from the rear. By the time she'd finished the sentence, the word watching triggering something faster than conscious decision in a man with his experience. Hale came back from point, hand on his weapon, scanning in the general direction she was facing. Where? She pointed. Rock fold on the southern exposure. 1.5 kilometers, maybe slightly more. Behind the minus. I know what I'm looking at. His voice was clipped, the tone of an officer, reminding a specialist of the chain of professional authority. I don't see anything. It's in the fold itself, not on top of it. The shadow angle it could be a natural formation. It could be. She raised her rifle. Not fast, not theatrical one, smooth, unhurried motion. Stock against her shoulder, cheek finding the rest, without needing to search for it. The eggs settled on the fold. At this magnification, the texture of the rock resolved clearly enough that she could see the pale edge of a lens scope, catching the morning sun at an angle that put the reflection exactly where it needed to be for the geometry to work. A spotter, lying prone in an uncomfortable position, but doing it anyway, because the position offered what he needed. Professional. She pressed the trigger. The crack of the shot moved out across the valley and came back off the far walls, in pieces, degraded by distance. In the rock fold, the shadow shifted, tilted, and went still. 3 seconds of complete silence. Hale's voice, automatic, training cutting through the shock. Contact, he stopped. Because there was nothing left to report contact on. Torres said quietly, "Lucky shot." She lowered the rifle. "We need to move right now." He had a radio. If he transmitted before I fired, they already know our position. How do you know he had? Hale started. The first mortar round landed. 200 meters south, close enough to send a plume of red dust and broken shale rising into the clear sky. Contact. Indirect. Shaw was already shouting over the patrol net, pulling soldiers into motion, pointing toward the nearest adequate cover, a boulder field 40 meters northeast, that would give them protection against anything but a direct hit. His hands moved before his words did, which was the mark of a man who'd done this too many times to waste motion on sequencing. The second round landed 130 meters out. The third landed exactly where they'd been standing 40 seconds earlier. Elena was already moving laterally, not toward the boulder field with the others, but angling uphill along the slope, using the terrain's fold to mask her movement from the southern exposure. She needed line of sight to the mortar position. She needed it, and she needed it faster than the tubes could adjust their elevation. Vale, Shaw's voice sharp and carrying. She keyed her radio without breaking stride. I see the firing position. South slope, 700 meters. Behind the secondary ridgeline, there's a notch at the base. I'm going to call it. Get behind cover. If they find us again, they'll walk the rounds right onto the boulder field. I need 40 seconds. Silence on the net. She used the 40 seconds. The mortar team had set up in a natural depression that concealed them from the valley floor, but not from her current angle. She could see the bipod legs of the tube and the dark shape of 2 men. And beyond them, a third figure farther back, who wasn't carrying equipment. An observer, coordinating by radio with someone, because the mortar crew itself wouldn't have had direct visibility. She called the coordinates clean and precise into her radio. Tube position confirmed. Request fire mission or authority to Negative on fire mission. That was Hale's voice, tighter than before. FOB's already tracking. Hold position. She held position. The mortar crew fired 2 more rounds, both long, both searching, both missing, and then went quiet. She watched the observer figure speak into a handset. Wait, speak again. Then the crew began breaking down the tube. Methodical, practiced. Not panicked. They weren't running because they were scared. They were disengaging because they had what they came for. The firing stopped 11 minutes after it started. She moved back to the boulder field when it was clear the engagement was over. Shaw looked at her once, said nothing. Torres and Jennings were checking each other over shaken but uninjured. A small cut on Jennings' forearm from a rock fragment, nothing requiring more than field dressing. Webb had a ring of temporary deafness from the nearest impact and kept asking people to repeat themselves. Hale crouched behind the largest boulder and looked at Elena with an expression that had moved past skepticism into something else. Something more complicated. How far was that shot? He asked. About 1,400 meters, give or take. He absorbed that. The target was behind a rock fold, lying flat. Yes. And you spotted him from. The shadow angle was wrong. He waited, clearly expecting more than that. She didn't give him more than that. You're not a signal specialist, he said, not loud, almost to himself. I'm a signal specialist who also shoots, sir. That's not what I meant. She held his gaze without expression. The mortar crew had our route. Not a general estimate, the actual route, the timing, the spacing. The second round landed where we were supposed to be, not where we were. We deviated because I stopped. If we'd stayed on schedule, it would have been on top of Torres. Hale went still. Somebody fed that route outside this phobie, she said. And the crew broke down that tube too calmly. They weren't scared. They were done. Which means this wasn't a kill attempt. Then what was it? A measurement. She looked back toward the phobie's general direction, invisible from here behind the ridge. They wanted to know our response time, our patrol pattern, our comms lag between contact and fire mission. They were collecting data. Hale stared at her for a long moment. The hand he had pressed flat against the boulder to steady himself was not quite steady. We need to move, she said, before the light changes. He stood, called the patrol back into formation, and they moved. He didn't ask her anything else, but she caught him watching her twice more during the return route, the look of a man revising a calculation he'd thought was already finished. The debrief ran 40 minutes back at the FOB. Shaw gave the primary report. Hale added tactical assessment. Elena sat in the back of the room and answered 2 direct questions, one about the comms traffic during the engagement, one about the GPS verification of the mortar coordinate she'd called and volunteered nothing else. Afterward, Shaw found her at the cleaning station. He sat down without asking and set his own rifle across the table and didn't touch it. Just sat there for a moment like a man who had decided on a conversation and was choosing his opening carefully. Tell me what I'm actually working with, he said. Not the file. The file's mostly holes anyway. The real thing. She looked at the firing pin in her hand, then at him. I did work that's not on any accessible record, she said. Some of it was because I was specifically good at certain things. Some of it was because I was easy to put in places without being noticed. She set the pin down. And then something happened, and most of that record got locked. And I ended up here. Something happened. Yes, that you're not going to explain. That I can't explain yet. Not to you. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the interrogation quality and picked up something more careful. Those mortar rounds. You said the crew had our exact route. The second impact was targeting where we should have been, not where we were, which means someone with access to our patrol schedule. Yes, inside the wire. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. He stood up, and she thought he was going to walk away, but he stopped and looked at the disassembled rifle in front of her. Your firing pin? You're rushing it. She looked down. He was right. She'd been distracted and had seated it slightly off-center. She picked it up and started again. Shaw, she said. He was already moving away. He stopped, but didn't turn. Whoever fed them that route, they've been doing it long enough that the enemy has a calibrated picture of this base. Response times, comms lag, patrol frequency, defensive gaps. She kept her voice flat and even, like she was reading from a report. They're not going to wait long before they do something with it. The generator ground on behind the walls. Somewhere across the compound, someone laughed at something bright and easy and completely disconnected from the conversation happening here. How long? Shaw asked. She thought about the way the mortar crew had moved. Calm, efficient, practiced. The observer on the radio, speaking without urgency. Days, she said. Not weeks. He walked away without answering. She seated the firing pin correctly, assembled the rest of the rifle, checked the actions, safed it, and set it down across the cleaning cloth. Then she sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed through what she knew and what she still didn't know, and the specific weight of being in a place where she was the only person who understood the shape of what was coming. In the classified sections of her personnel file, the blacked-out pages Shaw hadn't been able to read, there was a date, a map grid, a mission designation, and 5 names. There was a decision she'd made without authorization during an operation that had gone wrong in a way nobody wanted to formally examine. Her command had called it a failure and sealed it. She had spent 3 years trying to decide if they were right. She was starting to think the answer was more complicated than right or wrong. She was also starting to think that whoever had routed her specifically to this specific OP, whoever had wanted her here at this time, in this place, understood something about her that her own command had tried to bury. The question was whether they'd sent her here to use that understanding or to test it. Outside, the wind picked up, coming down off the ridge from the north, dropping the temperature faster than the season warranted. Across the wire, somewhere in the dark beyond the floodlights, the desert was vast and quiet and patient in the way that places are patient when they have been witness to more than their geography suggests. She picked up her rifle and held it across her lap and looked at nothing in particular. The mortar crew was either retreating or regrouping. She was certain it was regrouping, but what she didn't know yet, what she couldn't see from here, was that the mortar test wasn't the operation. The mortar test was the introduction, and the people who had run it weren't waiting on the enemy's timeline. They were waiting on hers, and she had just shown them everything they needed to know about what she was capable of. She was right about the timeline. 41 hours after the mortar test, the first probe hit the northern perimeter. It wasn't a serious assault. 3 fighters, suppressed rifles, a brief exchange of fire that lasted 90 seconds fell before they pulled back into the dark. No casualties on either side. The duty officer logged it as a harassment contact and filed it under the category of routine. Shaw read the report the next morning, set it down, and went looking for Elena. She was already in the comms tent, had been since 430, with a topographic printout spread across the table and 4 different colored markers arranged by meaning she'd invented herself. She'd been awake most of the night. He could tell by the quality of her stillness, not rested stillness, but the particular flatness of a person running on adrenaline reserve and refusing to acknowledge it.
You saw the saws,
he said. Northern perimeter, 217. 3-man element, suppressed weapons, 90-second contact, broke contact clean. She didn't look up from the map. They weren't trying to breach. They were checking response time. Same thing you said the mortar crew was doing, because it's the same operation. Different data point. She set a finger on the map, northeast of the FOB's position. They've run measurements on the eastern approach, the southern firing corridor, and now the northern perimeter response. That leaves the western slope and the interior comms lag. Shaw pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down across from her. He looked at the map, at the colored markers, at the notes she'd made in her small, careful handwriting in the margins. Then he looked at her. When did you put this together? I started the framework after the patrol. Last night filled in some gaps. She circled something on the map with the red marker. There's a terrain feature here, a wadi system, that runs parallel to the western approach. It's not our standard patrol coverage, because the gradient makes it difficult. If I were planning an assault on this FOB, that's where I'd stage the main element. And you're telling me this because I've been trying to tell Hale since 600, and he won't hear it. Shaw's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. What did he say? He said the northern contact was routine. He said my pattern analysis was speculation. He said she stopped, picked up the blue marker, set it down. He said I should focus on my comms duties and let the tactical assessment to people with tactical training. The generator outside shifted pitch slightly, straining against something. Shaw watched Elena's face. She was holding herself very still in the way people held themselves still when they were deciding how much anger was useful in a given moment, and how much was waste. He's not entirely wrong, Shaw said. She looked up then. Sharp. I'm not saying you're wrong, he said. I'm saying he's working with what he knows about you, which is almost nothing. You haven't given him a reason to. I gave him a 1,400-meter shot through a rock fold at a target he couldn't see. You gave him a shot he's still half convinced was luck. She stared at him. Then he's a fool. He's a 27-year-old lieutenant who's been in country 8 months and has never lost a man and is very committed to keeping that record. Shaw leaned forward slightly. That's not foolish. That's someone managing their own limits. You need to work with that, not against it. Elena looked back at the map. She pressed her palm flat against it for a moment, like she was checking whether it was real. They're going to hit this base, she said. Not probe it. Hit it, I think, within the week, based on the rate of data collection and the fact that they've now covered almost every approach vector. They're not building intelligence for someone else. This is their own operation. They're doing the reconnaissance themselves because they're going to run the assault themselves. She looked up. This isn't a local cell, Shaw. This is organized. The coordination, the patience, the methodology, somebody with real training is running this. Shaw sat with that for a moment. Outside, boots on gravel, the morning shift change on the perimeter, coming through right on time. Routine. Everything at Fort Blackridge was routine, and that was the problem. I'll talk to Hale, he said. He won't listen. Maybe not. But I'll talk to him. He stood, pushed the chair back. And Vale, keep putting this together. Whatever you're building here, he gestured at the map. Keep going. Just do it quietly. She didn't answer. She'd already picked up the red marker again. Lieutenant Hale's office was a repurposed storage room with a plywood desk and a single overhead light that buzzed like an insect that had made a bad navigational decision. Shaw knocked twice and went in without waiting, which was his established practice and which Hale had stopped objecting to sometime around month 3. Hale was reading something on his laptop, the screen angled away from the door. He closed it when Shaw sat down. The northern contact, Shaw said. Logged and reported up. Brigade is aware. Vale thinks it's part of a reconnaissance pattern. She's mapped 4 separate contact events against approach vectors and thinks they're building up to a main assault. Hale leaned back in his chair. It made a sound that suggested it had been leaning back too many times over too short a period. Vale. He said the name, the way you said the name of a problem you decided to manage rather than solve. She's been here 9 days. She is. She's a signals specialist. She's something else too. I think you know that. Hale looked at Shaw steadily, not hostile, measured. He was good at measured. It was one of the things he was genuinely good at. What I know is that we have a specialist with no accessible combat record, who has on one occasion made an impressive shot under pressure. That's useful. It doesn't make her a tactical analyst. The pattern she's identified is one possible interpretation of 3 unrelated contacts over 2 weeks. Hale picked up a pen and set it down. Brigade's assessment is that we're seeing increased local insurgent activity consistent with the seasonal pattern, which it is. Seasonal pattern doesn't explain the suppressed weapons on the northern probe. Hale paused, just fractionally. No, he said, it doesn't. She's mapping the Western Wadi as the likely main assault approach. I've looked at the Western Wadi. The gradient is difficult, not impossible. She knows the difference. Hale was quiet for a moment. Shaw waited him out. That was a skill he'd developed across 11 years, the ability to let silence work without filling it, which ran counter to most people's instincts, and was one of the more practically useful things he'd ever learned. Have her write it up, Hale said finally. A formal threat assessment. I'll read it and consider it. She's not going to want to write a report. Then she doesn't get to be upset when her analysis isn't acted on. Shaw looked at him for a moment. Then he stood. I'll tell her. Shaw. Hale's voice stopped him at the door. I'm not dismissing her. I'm asking her to use the correct channel. I know what you're doing, sir. He didn't say whether he thought it was right. He told her. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who had heard this particular version of use the correct channel many times before and understood exactly what it was designed to accomplish. A written report, she said. Formal threat assessment. His words. So that if he doesn't act on it, there's a paper trail that proves he considered it. And if he does act on it, the recommendation is in his file and the analysis is mine. She was quiet for a moment. That's actually fairly standard. Are you going to write it? She picked up the red marker. I'll have it to him by 1,400. She wrote it. 4 pages, tight and clean and organized, without being academic. She'd written enough of these, in other contexts and under other designations, to know what made them readable by someone who had decisions to make and limited time to make them. She laid out the contact chronology, the approach vector analysis, the assessment of the enemy's methodology, and the projected timeline. She assessed the probability of a main assault at 70% within 72 hours and noted the Western Wadi as the highest confidence approach corridor. She did not speculate about the source of the enemy's intelligence. She kept that out of the document deliberately, because speculating about an informant in a written report that would be read by everyone in the chain of command was either brave or profoundly stupid, depending on how it landed, and she needed to choose her timing on that particular piece of information more carefully. She handed the report to Shaw at 1,352. He read it standing in the corridor, which took him 4 minutes. This is good, he said. It's accurate. Same thing in this case. He folded it and walked toward Hale's office. She went back to the comms tent and ran her equipment checks and monitored the patrol frequencies and waited. At 1,740, a patrol came back early. 2-man element that had gone out for a route survey on the eastern approach, back 40 minutes ahead of schedule. Private Torres and Corporal Webb, both breathing harder than a routine survey warranted, Webb carrying his rifle across his body instead of in the standard slung position. Elena was at the antenna array when she heard the early return called in on the net. She walked to the vehicle entrance and watched them come through. Torres was talking before he'd fully cleared the gate. Contact on the eastern ridge. 2-man element, maybe 3. They had eyes on us from the high ground. We marked their position and pulled. Shaw was there in under a minute. He pulled them both aside and ran the debrief himself, not waiting for Hale. Elena stood at the periphery and listened. They'd spotted the observation position at roughly 900 meters, a natural rock formation that offered a line of sight down onto the eastern approach. The element had been there a while, based on the amount of equipment, evidence Torres had seen through his scope, a spotting scope on a tripod, a radio handset, Supply cache for at least 2 or 3 days. They're not moving, Torres said. They've got a static position up there. Like they're waiting. Shaw looked at Elena. She kept her face neutral. Same Wadi system? She asked. East side of the ridge. Yeah. Torres looked at her, then at Shaw, then back. How did you... It's consistent with the pattern. Shaw told Torres and Webb to get cleaned up and get food, and he'd debrief them formally in an hour. Then he turned to Elena and said quietly, Hale. Did he read the report? He's reading it now. They walked toward Hale's office. The base was moving into its evening rhythm lights coming up, generator load increasing. The smell of chow from the mess building, mixing with the persistent dust. Normal. Surface level normal. Elena walked through it and felt the gap between what the FOB looked like and what was actually moving around it. And the gap had the particular quality of a thing that was about to close suddenly. Hale was at his desk with her report open in front of him when they came in. He looked up. His expression was harder to read than usual. Torres and Webb made contact, Shaw said. Static observation post on the eastern ridge. They've been there at least 2 days. Hale looked down at the report. Then back up. Static position. Equipped for multi-day. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the report and set it down again. Something in the gesture was reluctant, not resistant, but reluctant, which was different. Your timeline, he said to Elena. 72 hours. That estimate was made before the Eastern Ridge confirmation. I'd revise it now. To what? 48. Maybe less. He looked at the report again. Then at the wall above Shaw's head, where there was nothing to look at, which meant he was looking inward and didn't want anyone to see what that process looked like. I'll request additional reinforcement through brigade, he said. How long for a response? Elena asked. 24 hours minimum for acknowledgement. 48 for any actual movement. She did the math out loud, not because she needed to, but because she wanted him to hear it. If my revised timeline is right, reinforcement doesn't arrive in time to be a factor. Then we defend with what we have, Hale said. His voice was flat, and even the voice of a man accepting a conclusion he didn't like. We can do more than just defend, she said. Both men looked at her. If we know the approach corridor, the Western Wadi, we can pre-position. Set up prepared firing positions, place obstacles, pre-plan mortar coordinates. Turn the approach from their advantage into ours. She watched Hale's face. We'd be defending forward instead of reactive. It changes the math. That requires pulling people from the perimeter to work the Wadi. Temporarily. At night, when the observation post on the eastern ridge loses visual. Hale studied her. You've done this before. She didn't answer that. You've planned defensive preparation for a forward operating position before, he said. Not asking. I've read about it extensively, she said. Shaw made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Hale stood. He was taller than he looked when sitting, which was a thing she hadn't fully registered until now. Give me a preparation plan. Firing positions, obstacle placement, mortar pre-planning, the whole thing. By 2100. It'll be done. And Vale, he stopped. Seemed to be selecting his words the way you selected footing on uncertain ground. I read the report, the whole thing. He paused again. It's good analysis. It was the closest he was going to come to saying he'd been wrong to dismiss her. She accepted it for what it was. Thank you, sir, she said, and meant it about 60%. She had the preparation plan done by 2045, which was 15 minutes ahead of deadline, and not intentional, she'd simply finished. Shaw took one look at it and said, this is a full defensive operation order. It's a preparation plan. It has pre-plotted fire missions and alternate fighting positions. Yes, for a base that technically isn't expecting an assault. For a base that very much is expecting an assault. She took it back. I can remove the... Don't change anything. He handed it back. Hale approved it with minor modifications at 2,130, and by 2,324 man-working parties were out in the darkness, moving through the Western Wadi under strict noise discipline, placing markers and digging shallow fighting positions and stringing comm wire that would let the mortar section tie in to pre-plotted fire solutions. Elena was with the second party. Shaw had told her to stay inside. She'd nodded and then gone out with the second party, and when Shaw found out, he said nothing, which she interpreted correctly. The wadi was worse on the ground than on the map. The gradient ran at about 30% in places, with loose scree over compressed sandstone that shifted under weight in unpredictable ways. Working in the dark without lights, in silence, while also listening for the sound of approach from higher ground, it was the kind of work that made you understand why people who had done it before moved differently than people who hadn't. Private Okafor was in her working party. He moved carefully, placed his feet well, and didn't complain, which elevated him considerably in her estimation. At one point he crouched beside her while they waited for the lead element to signal clear and whispered, breath just barely at voice level. "You did this before." Like, actually, didn't you? She looked at him sideways in the dark. "I'm not being weird about it," he said. You move different out here than you do inside the wire. And the way you're reading this terrain. It's not a comms thing." She thought about to say for a moment. "Go back to listening," she said finally. He was quiet. Then, "Yeah, okay." She watched him settle back into his position and understood that he was going to be fine out here. He was the kind of soldier who didn't need to be right about things, just needed to understand what was real. That was rarer than most people thought. The working party finished at 110. They came back inside the wire at 130, covered in dust and scree, and the particular kind of tired that came from physical work done under sustained tension. Elena reported completion to Shaw, who was waiting at the vehicle entrance with a mug of coffee and the expression of a man who had been awake since 430 the previous morning and had decided that sleep was a problem for some future version of himself. "Hale's requesting reinforcement through brigade," he said. No response yet. "He won't get one in time." "I know that." "He knows that." Shaw handed her the coffee without ceremony. It was terrible, burnt and oversteeped, the kind of coffee that a base generator and a tired corporal produced after midnight. She drank it anyway. "Shaw," she said. "I know." "The informant?" "Not tonight. It needs to—" "I said not tonight. I need to think about it." He took the empty mug back. "Get a few hours. Whatever happens in the next 24 hours, you need to be functional for it." She looked at him for a moment. Then the unlogged comms equipment in the tent. The two modifications that aren't on the manifest. He went still. "They're transmitters," she said, "not receivers. They're pushing a signal on a frequency that our monitoring isn't calibrated for. I found it last night." She watched his face process that. "I haven't touched them. I haven't told Riggs. I wanted to tell you first." Shaw stood very still for a long moment. The generator ground on. The guard on the nearest tower shifted his weight, the sound of it carried by the cold air. "Who installed them?" he said. His voice was very careful. "I don't know yet. But they've been running for at least 3 weeks. Long enough for someone to build a very accurate picture of this FOB's communications patterns." She paused. "The signal goes out during the patrol windows, when the comms tent is busiest and the traffic is easiest to mask." Shaw looked at the comms tent building, visible from here as a dark rectangular shape against the slightly lighter dark of the wall behind it. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Somewhere beyond the wire, the desert was cold and empty and vast, and the night had the particular quality of a held breath. "Get some sleep," he said finally. 3 hours. I'll handle this." Shaw, 3 hours, Vale. "That's not optional." He walked in the direction of Hale's building, his stride carrying the weight of a man who had just been handed a problem that changed the shape of everything he thought he understood about where he was standing. She watched him go. Then she looked at the comms tent and at the dark around the FOB, and at the blacked-out western ridgeline where the wadi ran cold and silent with its new prepared positions and pre-planned fire solutions. 48 hours. Maybe less. She went to her bunk. She lay down in the dark and closed her eyes and did the deliberate controlled breathing that her body had been trained to use when sleep was necessary and instinct was fighting it. She thought about the 5 names in the blacked out section of her file. She thought about the mountain in Kunar province and the decision she'd made without authorization and the way her command had looked at her when they told her what it meant for her record. She thought about the specific feeling of being buried while you were still standing. She slept for exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes before the first explosion woke her. It was the Western Wadi, and it was not a probe. The explosion came from the Western Wadi, exactly where she'd said it would. Elena was on her feet before the sound, fully registered boots on, rifle in hand, moving through the bunk room door, while the other personnel in the building were still sitting up and asking each other what that was. She didn't run. Running blind in a base under attack was how you got shot by your own perimeter guards. She moved fast and low and deliberate, angling toward the comms tent first, because the comms tent was her job and because whoever was hitting them would want the communications infrastructure early if they understood anything about how FOBs functioned. The second explosion hit the northern wall. Closer, louder, different acoustic signature, not mortar, RPG, which meant the Western Wadi wasn't the only axis. They were coming from 2 directions. She'd planned for one. She revised as she moved, which was uncomfortable and necessary. The pre-positioned fighting positions in the Wadi were still valuable. Whoever was pushing through there would run into prepared ground. But if they had a simultaneous northern element, the FOB's internal defense needed to account for split attention, and the mortar section couldn't service 2 separate fire missions at the same rate as one. She hit the comms tent at a controlled run, ducked inside. Riggs was already there, headset on, hands shaking slightly over the transmit key. "I've got brigade on standby. Send the contact report. All of it Western Wadi assault. Northern RPG contact. Unknown enemy strength. Request immediate fire support and medevac on standby." She was already at the secondary console, pulling up the pre-planned fire solution files she'd built the night before. "What's our mortar section status?" "They're manned. Kellerman's got them. Tell Kellerman Fire Mission Alpha 1 is active. He has the pre-plots. Tell him to verify his aiming stakes before he fires first round, because it's dark and people get lazy." He's a sergeant. I can't just Riggs." She looked at him directly. "Send the message." He sent it. Outside, small arms fire opened up on the western side, the distinctive flat crack of AK variants, multiple weapons, not suppressed this time. They weren't being subtle anymore. The pre-positioned element in the Wadi had made contact with something, either one of the prepared obstacles or an early trip flare, and now both sides knew exactly where the fight was starting. She heard Shaw's voice on the patrol net, cutting through the noise, steady and hard. All elements, western perimeter is active. Northern wall has taken RPG damage. Sector assignments are in effect. Do not bunch up. Do not move without comms. Hale, you have command. Then Hale's voice, a half-second behind, acknowledged. All sectors respond. Sector responses came in. East was clear. South was clear. North had the RPG damage wall breach. Partial, no personnel casualties yet. West was the active fight. She pulled up the Wadi fire solution on her screen and keyed the mortar net. "Kellerman, this is Vale. Fire Mission Alpha 1, confirm ready." A pause. Too long. "Kellerman. Who is this?" His voice came back irritated, pressured. A man doing 4 things at once. "Vale, comms. The pre-plotted solutions from last night." "Are you ready to fire?" "I know what the pre-plots are." "Stand by." She stood by for 11 seconds, which was about 8 seconds longer than she wanted to. Then ready. "Fire Alpha 1, first round HE, confirm." The mortar fired. She counted the hang time against her mental map of the terrain and the pre-plotted range. The round impacted in the Wadi approach corridor, approximately where she'd estimated, which she couldn't visually confirm from inside the tent, but could partially verify from the change in the small arms pattern. The volume dropped briefly. The rhythm broke, which meant the round had landed close enough to the assault element to disrupt their movement. Adjust right 15, add 50, she said. How do you know? The fire shifted right on the small arms contact. They've moved right of the primary corridor. Adjust and fire. Another pause, shorter this time. The second round went. The small arms volume dropped again, more significantly. Valid, Kellerman said. The single word carried something she hadn't heard from him before. She ran the fire solution from the tent for 4 minutes, walking rounds into the Wadi approach while the FOB's defensive positions engaged with direct fire. It wasn't clean, nothing about it was clean, and she made 2 adjustments that were wrong before she corrected them, which cost time and potentially rounds she'd need later. But the assault element in the Wadi was slowing. She could hear it in the pattern of the contact. Then Hale's voice on the command net, tighter than before, northern breach. They're through the wall. She stopped. Inside the wire. She handed the mortar fire mission to Riggs. Keep Kellerman on Alpha 1, adjust only on my direct instruction, and move to the door of the comms tent. Outside, the FOB had transformed from organized defensive positions into something more complicated. Flares going up on the northern end, throwing moving light across the interior compound. The breach in the northern wall was spilling fighters through, not many, 5 or 6 maybe, based on the volume of contact, but inside the wire changed the geometry of everything. Shaw's voice, breach team, northern interior. Torres, Webb, Okafor with me. She moved toward the northern end of the compound. Shaw turned and saw her coming, and for a fraction of a second, his face did something complicated. Then he turned back and pointed her toward the right flank of his improvised breach response team. Without saying a word, which was either trust or pragmatism or both, and she took the position without requiring it to be anything more defined than that. The breach point was a section of northern wall that the RPG had taken down to roughly chest-height rubble and twisted Hesco facing on the compound side, a gap about 4 meters wide. 3 fighters had come through and were using an equipment shed as cover, engaging the guard tower to the northwest. 2 more were still climbing through the rubble. A 6th was down, not moving, on the exterior side. Shaw signaled them the movement, without speaking, hands only. The kind of communication that worked because everyone reading it had the same baseline and trusted the person sending it. Left element suppresses. Right element flanks the shed. She was right element with Webb. They moved. She went around the shed's left corner while Webb took the right, and she came around into the back of the position where 2 of the fighters had consolidated, and the next several seconds were close and loud, and not the kind of thing that had a clean description. She fired twice, moved, fired once more, and then it was over in the specific way that close engagements ended, not with any sense of completion, just with silence where there had been noise. Webb was on the ground. She was at his side before she'd consciously decided to move. Shoulder wound, bleeding significantly, but not arterial, she could tell by the color and the pressure pattern. She pressed his own hand against it and told him to hold hard, and he did. "I'm good," he said, which was not true but was the right response. "You're not good, but you're not dying. Hold that." She looked up. Shaw had the remaining fighters at the breach point contained. Torres had one down. Okafor was covering the gap, muzzle on the exterior. The 2 fighters still trying to come through the rubble had pulled back. She could hear them moving. The scrape of boots on broken concrete pulling away. "Breach is contained," Shaw called on the net. "Northern interior clear. 1 friendly WIA, walking wounded." Hale came back immediately, confirmed. "Western contact?" She keyed her radio as she moved back toward the comms tent. "Western assault has stalled in the prepared ground." They took at least 2 direct mortar impacts on their primary corridor and deviated right. I've been running fire solutions from inside. Current status is suppressed, not broken. A pause. Then Vale, you've been running the fire mission? Riggs has the radio. I've been calling the adjustments. Another pause, this one longer. She could almost hear him deciding how to file that information. Continue, he said. She continued. The Western assault broke at 347. Not dramatically. Assault elements didn't retreat dramatically. They just stopped pressing and started moving backward, and the fire that had been incoming became outgoing, and then became nothing. The wadi went quiet in segments, the eastern part first, then the approach corridor, then the staging area she'd estimated was behind the first ridgeline. Silence arrived gradually, which made it feel more real than the fighting had. She sat in the comms tent and talked brigade through the contact report while Riggs watched her with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he'd understood. The brigade watch officer wanted details she had and details she didn't have and kept asking her to confirm things she couldn't confirm from where she was. And she was precise about the distinction, which frustrated him and was nonetheless the correct approach. When the call was done, she set the handset down and put both hands flat on the console table and breathed. The FOB had held. The prepared positions in the wadi had forced the assault element to compress and slow. The pre-plotted fire solutions had hit the right corridors because she'd built them from actual terrain analysis rather than assumption. Webb was getting his shoulder treated in the aid station and would be fine. Nobody was dead. It was not a success. It was a situation that had been worse than it needed to be, because the base had been compromised before the assault began, and it had been held by a margin thinner than anyone in the debrief would be comfortable admitting. She sat there for a moment in the quiet and thought about that margin. Then she went to find Shaw. He was at the northern breach point with 2 soldiers, supervising the initial reconstruction sandbags stacked into the gap, not structural, just enough to close the visual line and slow any secondary attempt. The flares had burned out, and the generator-powered lights had taken over, casting the compound in the flat yellow of practical illumination. In that light, everybody looked tired and a little damaged, which was accurate. Shaw looked at her when she approached. He had a cut along his left forearm, fresh, field-dressed with a bandage wrap that he'd done himself, the tape slightly uneven. He hadn't mentioned it on the net. The comms equipment, she said. I need to pull it now. Already done. He kept his eyes on the soldiers working the sandbags. I pulled both units at 230. Before the assault started. She processed that. You moved them. I bagged them and locked them in my footlocker. They're not transmitting anymore. Did you tell Hale? Yes. And? Shaw turned from the sandbags and looked at her directly. He wants the full debrief in 2 hours. He's going to have questions about how long you knew. I told you last night. I know. I'm telling you what he's going to ask. She looked at the breach point, at the broken wall, at the new sandbags sitting awkward and provisional in the gap. The units were installed 3 weeks ago. The patrol route leak started around the same time. Whoever installed them had access to this base and enough technical knowledge to do it without Riggs noticing. Riggs isn't exactly... I know what Riggs is. I'm saying the person who did this knew what they were doing. She looked back at Shaw. Was Kellerman here 3 weeks ago? Shaw's expression didn't change exactly. Something behind it went careful. Don't, he said. I'm not accusing. I'm asking. Kellerman's been here 6 months. So have 12 other people. He paused. So have I. She met his eyes. I know. Neither of them said anything for a moment. 2 hours, Shaw said. Debrief. Get cleaned up first. You've got somebody else's blood on your sleeve. She looked down. He was right. She hadn't noticed. She went back to her bunk room and changed her shirt and washed her face and hands in the cold water from the basin and looked at herself in the small scratched mirror above the sink. For a moment, the face of a person who hadn't slept properly in. 60 hours, who had just spent 40 minutes running a fire mission from a communications tent while also clearing a breach, and who had a debrief in 2 hours where she would be asked to explain by an officer who had spent the last 9 days managing her like a secondary concern why she'd known things that nobody else at this base had known. She looked at her own face and didn't particularly like what she saw, which was normal. She was accustomed to not particularly liking what she saw. She dried her hands and went back out. The debrief was in Hale's office, and it was crowded Shaw on one side, Kellerman in the back, because he was the mortar section sergeant and had relevant input, Riggs near the door because Hale had decided comms accountability mattered. Hale himself was behind his plywood desk with the contact report and her original threat assessment printed and laid flat in front of him, side by side. He looked like a man who had been awake all night and had processed the results of that night into something usable, which was what a good officer did. Tremtes, officer, she was revising her assessment of him in increments, and the current revision was better than the one she'd started with. "Walk me through the fire mission," he said. She walked him through it. Methodical, sequential, nothing left out. She included the 2 adjustments she'd gotten wrong and the corrections she'd made, because accuracy in debriefs mattered more than reputation management. When she finished, Hale looked at the threat assessment. "You built these fire solutions yesterday. Night before last. During the working party. In the dark. Yes. You pre-plotted mortar coordinates for a defensive fire plan on terrain you'd walked once, at night, without survey equipment. I used pace count and compass, and the mapping data we had cross-referenced against the physical features I could verify. And they were accurate enough to use operationally. Close enough. I made adjustments." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Shaw, and something passed between them that she read as I know, on Shaw's side, and I'm getting there on Hale's. "The comms equipment," Hale said. "Tell me how you found it." She explained the discovery, the unlogged modifications, the signal frequency, the transmission pattern that aligned with patrol windows. She explained when she'd found it and when she'd told Shaw and why she hadn't reported it through the official channel immediately. "You sat on it for 24 hours, Hale said. "I sat on it for 8 hours. I told Shaw at 130. He pulled the units before the assault. You should have reported directly to me." She held the pause 1 beat. "With respect, sir, I reported to my immediate NCO. That's the correct channel." She let that land. "The channel you reminded me to use." Hale absorbed that without visible reaction, which required some effort. "The units are bagged," Shaw said. "Intact. Brigade forensics can pull the signal logs and trace the transmission history. If we're lucky, there are destination frequencies that can be backtraced. I want those units secured in my office," Hale said. "And I want a full equipment audit of the comms tent by 1,400. Every piece of hardware, every serial number, every installation date." He looked at Elena. "You'll run the audit." "Understood. And I want it documented who had access to that tent over the past month. Sign-in logs, shift assignments, any maintenance or resupply access." "Riggs has the logs," she said. "Some of them. The resupply access wasn't fully logged." She let that sit for a moment. That's how something gets installed without being noticed. An unlocked tent during a busy resupply and a 10-minute window. The room was quiet. Kellerman, in the back, hadn't said anything since the debrief started. She was aware of him in the peripheral way. She was aware of most things not focused on him, but tracking. Hale looked at the 2 documents in front of him one more time. The threat assessment she'd written and the contact report from the night's fight. He picked up the threat assessment. "Your projected assault timeline was 48 hours, he said. "It came in 31. "I know. Your approach corridor assessment was correct. Your defensive preparation is what held the wadi. The soldiers held the wadi, with positions and fire solutions you built." He set the document down. "I need to know what I'm actually working with here, specialist. Yet, because what I watched last night, the fire mission, the breach response, the way you moved, that wasn't a signal specialist working outside her lane. That was something else. The room waited. Kellerman shifted his weight slightly. Riggs was very still near the door. She looked at Hale. Then at Shaw, who gave her nothing, kept his face flat, and let her decide. It was the right call on his part. This was hers to give or not give. I did classified work for 3 years under a different assignment, she said. The details are in sections of my file that are restricted. During the last operation, I ran under that assignment. I made a command decision that wasn't authorized. The outcome was she stopped, chose the word, disputed. My primary record was reclassified and I was moved to a support role. What kind of classified work, Hale said. The kind where the job description and the actual job are different documents. He didn't push on that. He was smart enough to understand that pushing on it in this room with these people present wasn't the right move. The decision you made, he said, the unauthorized one. 5 soldiers came home because of it, and my career ended because of it. And I spent 3 years trying to decide which of those facts was more important. She said it evenly, without performance. I haven't finished deciding. The room was quiet for a long moment. The equipment audit, Hale said, finally, 1,400. Everything else can wait for brigade. She nodded and stood. Vale. His voice stopped her at the door. The phobie held last night. I want you to know I understand why. She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell by the way he said it. The slight roughness of a man delivering an acknowledgement that cost him something. It held because 14 people did their jobs under fire, she said. I just made some phone calls. She left before he could respond to that. She ran the equipment audit through the afternoon. Every piece of hardware in the comms tent, every serial number checked against the manifest, every installation date verified. She found 3 additional discrepancy, smaller ones, not transmitters, but logging gaps that suggested the tent's equipment had been accessed more times than the sign-in sheet reflected. She documented everything with the same small, careful handwriting she used for everything completed audit to Hale, and handed the completed audit to Hale at 1,347. He was on a call with brigade when she arrived, so she left it on his desk and walked back out. The FB was in daylight damage assessment soldiers, photographing the breach, engineering personnel evaluating the structural integrity of the repaired sections, the aid station treating the minor injuries that had accumulated overnight. It had the quality of a place that had been through something and was trying to determine what that something actually meant. She stopped outside the comms tent and looked at the western ridgeline visible over the wall. The Wadi was out there, quiet now, with its prepared to positions and spent brass and whatever other evidence the assault had left behind. Brigade would want a physical assessment of the approach corridor, which meant a patrol, which meant going outside the wire again. She went inside the tent, sat at the primary console, put her headset on, and ran the morning comms checks. Riggs came in 20 minutes later and sat at the secondary console without speaking. He ran his own checks. For a while, they worked in parallel silence, the comfortable kind that dips between people who have been through something together and don't need to process it out loud immediately. Then Riggs said, without looking up, "How long have you been doing this?" The real thing. She ran a frequency check. Long enough. That fire mission last night. I watched you run it. You helped. I relayed messages. You ran it. He paused. I've been doing this job for 4 years, and I couldn't have done what you did last night. She looked at him sideways. He was being straight with her, not flattering, just stating. There was a difference, and she could always tell. You did your job, she said. The night needed both. He nodded slowly, accepting that. Then, the 2 transmitters. I should have caught them. They were well installed. I should have caught them anyway. His voice had the particular quality of someone deciding to carry something rather than set it down. I'm going to be better about the audits. Yes, she said. You are. He looked at her and almost smiled, and then didn't, because it wasn't quite the right moment. Outside, someone was calling across the compound, not alarm, just work communication, the ordinary noise of a base putting itself back together. The generator had been repaired overnight and was running smoother than she'd heard it since she arrived, which felt like a small and irrelevant improvement, and somehow wasn't. Her radio crackled. Shaw on the command net? Vale, I need you in the planning room. Hales called a full operational review. Brigade wants an assessment of offensive options. She keyed the transmit. Offensive options. You heard right. They want to know if we can hit back. She looked at the western ridgeline again. The assault last night had been organized, resourced, and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Breaking it off cleanly, pulling back without leaving significant evidence that was discipline. The kind of discipline that came from somewhere with training and infrastructure behind it, which meant wherever they'd staged from was still there. Intact. Waiting. On my way, she said. She took off her headset, told Riggs she'd be back in an hour, and walked toward the planning room. She was already building the problem in her head as she walked the terrain, the approach routes, the likely staging area, the timeline for how long a withdrawn assault element took to reconsolidate before it was capable of another push. She was building it the way she'd built every other problem since she'd arrived at this FOB, the way she'd been building problems for years before a mountain in Kunar province, and an unauthorized decision, and 5 names had taken most of that work and locked it away where nobody could see it. She was done being locked away. She walked into the planning room and looked at the map on the wall and felt something in her chest settle into a place it hadn't occupied in a very long time. Here's what I think we can do, she said, before Hale could open the meeting. He looked at her. Shaw looked at her. The 4 other soldiers in the room looked at her. She pointed at the map. The staging area is here. She kept her finger on the map and let everyone in the room look at where she was pointing before she said anything else. The location was a terrain feature approximately 4 kilometers southwest of the FOB, a shallow bowl formation behind the secondary ridgeline, accessible from the Wadi system by 2 approach routes that were invisible from the fort's observation positions and from any standard aerial route the FOB support aircraft used. It wasn't on any of the patrol routes. It had never been assessed as a threat axis because the gradient leading to it suggested it was inaccessible to a vehicle-mounted element, which was true, and nobody had thought hard enough about a dismounted one. How confident are you? Hale said. 75%. The assault element last night broke contact cleanly and pulled southwest. Not south, not east-southwest, which is the only direction that routes naturally into that bowl without crossing open ground. A disciplined element pulling back after a failed assault goes to the nearest covered consolidation point. That's the bowl. She moved her finger slightly. Secondary staging could be here, the reverse slope of hill 1,142. But the distance from the breach point makes the timeline harder. Southwest is closer, more accessible, and it's been quiet on our patrol coverage for 3 weeks because we don't go there. Hale looked at the map. Shaw looked at the map. The 4 soldiers in the room, Torres, Okafor, and 2 others she knew, as Garza and Reyes looked at the map and then at each other. What are you proposing? Hale said. A strike on the staging area before they can reconsolidate and attempt a second assault. She pulled her hand back from the map. The assault last night failed. They lost personnel, they burned supplies, they didn't achieve breach. Standards operational logic says they'll reassess and try again with modifications. How long that takes depends on their resupply chain and their command structure. My estimate is 36 to 72 hours, which means we have a window, Shaw said. A narrow one. If we move in the next 12 to 18 hours, were hitting them during reconsolidation disorganized, taking inventory, not expecting offensive action from a base they just attacked. Hale was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the map, but she could tell he wasn't seeing terrain anymore. He was seeing the conversation he was about to have with Brigade, the liability calculation, the question of authority. Small foe Bs didn't launch offensive strikes without authorization. That was a rule with reasons behind it. Brigade won't sanction an offensive operation on a 12-hour timeline, he said. No, she agreed. They won't. So what are you actually proposing? She met his eyes. A reconnaissance patrol to the southwestern approach that happens to pass close enough to the staging area to conduct a battle damage assessment of last night's contact, which, if the assessment confirms active enemy presence, would provide sufficient grounds, immediate defensive action, understanding rules of engagement. The room was quiet. That's not a reconnaissance patrol, Hale said. No, she said. It's not. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She was aware that what she was describing occupied a specific gray space between authorized action and a decision made without sanction, exactly the kind of decision that had ended her previous assignment. She was aware of that, and she was proposing it anyway, which meant she'd already weighed the two sides of that particular scale and arrived at an answer she could live with. Hale looked at Shaw. What do you think? Shaw had his arms crossed and his eyes on the map, the posture of a man working a problem from multiple angles simultaneously. I think the base took a breach last night and will take another one if we sit here and wait for paperwork to clear. I think Vale's red on that staging area has been right about everything else so far. He paused. I think it's your call, LT. That's not an opinion. It's the honest version of one. Hale turned back to the map. He stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. 6 personnel, he said. Light load. Reconnaissance profile. We find what we find. He looked at Elena. You're on the patrol. Yes. You take direction from Shaw. Whatever happens out there, Shaw leads. Understood, and Vale. His voice dropped slightly, the register of a private conversation happening in a room full of people. If this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, she said. And it's on me, not you. I recommended it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to respect that hadn't finished forming yet. 1,300 departure, he said. Get your kit squared. The patrol went out at 1,258 because Torres could find his spare radio battery and spent 2 minutes tearing through his kit before Okafor handed him one without comment. Minor delays were the texture of real operations, and Elena had long since stopped expecting otherwise. 6 personnel, Shaw at lead, Elena at second position, Torres and Okafor in the middle, Garza and Reyes at rear. Light configuration, no heavy weapons, no crew-served equipment. Fast and quiet was the objective. The cover story for the patrol log was route survey, southwestern approach, maximum 4 hours. She moved behind Shaw and watched his footwork on the loose shale and thought about the last time she'd run a patrol profile like this. Not a combat patrol, not a security patrol, but the specific type that had a different objective written between the lines. Kunar Province, 3 years ago. Different terrain, different personnel, same feeling in the chest. The feeling of knowing that what you were doing might not be forgiven later, even if it was right now. She'd carried that feeling for 3 years. She'd gotten better at walking with it. The southwestern approach took them through a broken series of gullies that ran roughly parallel to the wadi, offering intermittent cover and a path that was hard on ankles and knees and completely invisible from the Phobes' observation positions. Shaw moved well through at steady pace, good interval discipline, frequent halts to listen. He was better in the field than she'd initially assessed from watching him inside the wire, which was the correct direction for a reassessment to go. At the 40-minute mark, they reached the secondary ridgeline, and Shaw called a halt in a natural depression behind a rock shelf. He moved up beside her, and they both looked southwest toward the bowl formation she'd identified. From this distance, the bowl was a depression in the terrain that, from the FOB's perspective, would have looked like nothing a topographic wrinkle. From here, with the right angle, she could see the reverse slope that concealed the interior, and the two approach tracks that led into it, and the faint discoloration of disturbed ground along the left track that meant something heavy and numerous had moved over it recently. Shaw saw it at the same time. "Left track," he said quietly. "Within the last 6 hours, the dust hasn't resettled fully." He looked through his binos for a long moment. "I count at least 2 prepared positions on the near lip of the bowl. There's cover there that isn't natural." She looked. He was right. The irregular shapes on the near rim had the wrong profile for natural rock formations, the specific wrongness of material that had been placed rather than deposited. "They're still there," she said. "Yeah, or they left a rear guard, and the main element pulled further back. Same problem either way." He lowered the binos. "If we move to confirm, we're inside their observation range." "Not from the right side. The east slope of the bowl has a blind approach, the rock formation, at bearing 045. Creates a shadow corridor all the way to 50 meters from the rim." She'd seen it on the map and confirmed it from her current angle. "We could get to 50 meters without being visible from the prepared positions." Shaw looked at her with the flat expression he used when he was doing math on something he wasn't sure he liked. "You want to go to 50 meters from an active enemy position with 6 people. I want to confirm what's in the bowl so we have grounds to call a fire mission. If we're made at 50 meters, then we have a very bad few minutes." "Yes, Vale Shaw," she held his eyes. "If they're in that bowl, they're 45 minutes from this phobie by fast march. Last night they came through the wadi with 30 people, and they're going to come back with more. I need to confirm what's there so we can hit it before that happens." He looked at the bowl, then at his soldiers, then back at her. 045 bearing, shadow corridor, he said. "Show me." She showed him. He looked at it for a long time, checking angles and distances with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that the difference between a good plan and a fatal one was often the quality of observation that preceded it. "Garza and Reyes hold here," he said finally. "The rest of us move to 50 meters. Slow, noise discipline, full stop on my signal. We observe, we count, we call it in, and we pull back. Nobody does anything without my signal." He looked at Elena last when he said it. She nodded. It took them 22 minutes to cover the ground to the shadow corridor approach, which was longer than the distance warranted, and exactly as long as it needed to be. At 53 meters from the bowl rim, Shaw raised his fist, and they all went flat against the shale and held. From this position, the interior of the bowl was partially visible through a gap in the near rim. Elena lay behind a rock shelf and looked through her ACOG and counted. 14 personnel visible. 2 crew-served weapons, 1 PKM on a bipod, 1 recoilless rifle being serviced by 2 men on the far side of the bowl. Supply cache on the eastern interior wall, substantial. She could see ammunition cans, at least 4 RPG tubes, and what looked like a radio station with an extended antenna array. Command element, possibly. This wasn't a reconsolidation point for a broken assault element. This was a command node. She tapped Shaw's arm and passed him the scope. He looked for 45 seconds and handed it back. She keyed her radio at the lowest viable volume and requested a connect to the FOB comm station, which was Riggs. She got him on the 3rd attempt. "Riggs, this is Vale. I need Hale on this net immediately. He's with Minitz. Right now, Riggs. 15 seconds. Then Hale, go ahead." "We have eyes on a command node in the bowl. At grid, she gave the coordinates from her GPS. 14 personnel, 2 crew-served weapons, recoilless rifle, radio station with extended antenna. This is not a staging area for last night's assault element. This is a command and control position." Silence on the net for a moment. "You're certain," Hale said. "The antenna array is the tell. You don't carry that for an assault element. This is somebody's operations center. Another silence. Longer. Pull back to the ridgeline and hold, Hale said. I'm getting brigade on the line. Shaw was already moving, hand signals, slow withdrawal. They pulled back to the ridgeline in 12 minutes without contact. Garza and Reyes were where they'd been left, both looking relieved in the specific way of soldiers who had been told to wait while other people did something dangerous. They held at the ridgeline for 19 minutes. The desert was very quiet, and the sun was at an angle that made the shale glow a dull orange, and Elena sat with her back against a rock and watched the sky and listened to the sounds of the environment and thought about nothing useful. Then Hale came back on the net. Brigade is authorizing a fire mission. Artillery support, fire for effect, grid coordinates confirmed. A pause. Vale, I need you to verify the grid one more time. She read it back. He confirmed. 8 minutes to first round, he said. Get your people clear of the target area. Shaw was already moving them. They pulled 600 meters northeast into a depression that put two ridge lines between them and the bowl, and then went flat and waited. The artillery came in at 1,449, which was 7 minutes after the 8-minute call, which was normal. 4 rounds, fire for effect, adjusted by the artillery's own observer, working from the GPS coordinates. The sound of it was massive in the confined terrain, not the crack of small arms or the sharp bang of a mortar, but the deep concussive thud of something much larger, repeated, the kind of sound that reorganized your internal geography. The radio traffic that followed told the story in fragments. Secondary explosions from the ammunition cache. The recoilless rifle destroyed. Radio intercepts going dead simultaneously across 2 frequencies, which meant the antenna array was gone. And then, from the artillery observer's eyes overhead, a count of personnel who were no longer moving. Shaw listened to all of it without expression. When the traffic went quiet, he stood and looked southwest toward the smoke that was visible above the ridgeline. Good call, he said. It was not a throwaway compliment. It was a statement of fact from a man who measured his words carefully. The grid coordinates were accurate, she said. That's not what I meant. She knew what he meant. She didn't say anything else. They were back inside the wire by 1,600. Hale met them at the vehicle entrance, which he hadn't done before. He looked at Elena first, then at Shaw. Brigade wants a debrief, he said. Full debrief, recorded. Colonel Mercer is coming out personally. He paused. He's coming out tomorrow. Shaw raised an eyebrow. Mercer, personally. Yes. Elena felt something shift in her chest. Not alarm, exactly. More like the specific sensation of a situation accelerating past the point where she controlled its direction. Colonel Richard Mercer was a name she knew. She knew it from documents that had her name in them, and his signature at the bottom, and a date in Kunar province that she'd spent 3 years trying not to think about too directly. What does Mercer want with this debrief? She said. Her voice came out flat. Good. He didn't specify. Hale looked at her with the careful attention of someone who had noticed something in her reaction and was deciding how much to acknowledge it. Do you know him? We've crossed paths. Professionally. Yes. Hale held the look for a moment. Then get cleaned up. Full debrief at 800 tomorrow. Everyone who was on that patrol, plus the engagement report from last night. He walked away. She watched him go. Shaw came up beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there in the way he stood when he was thinking something through. Mercer, he said finally. Yes. Is that a problem? She looked at the gate, still open behind them, the desert visible through it in a frame of metal and sandbag. I don't know yet, but it might be. Yes. He nodded slowly. Then let's make sure the debrief record is clean before he gets here. She looked at him. Clean meaning accurate. I know what clean means, he said. Same thing it always means. Accurate, complete. Nothing left out. He paused. Including whatever you did to make Mercer's name put that look on your face? She didn't answer that. She walked toward the barracks. She spent the evening writing. Not a report she'd learned enough about reports and what happened to them to be careful about the format of things she committed to official paper. She wrote in the notebook, the small one from her breast pocket, the one with the equipment serial numbers and the terrain notes and the margins full of observations she hadn't figured out what to do with yet. She wrote about Kunar province, about the mountain operations, and the decision she'd made, and the 5 soldiers whose names she'd been carrying for 3 years. She wrote it out fully for the first time since the original incident review, because she was going to need to be able to say it clearly tomorrow, and she needed to know if she could still say it without it breaking something. It didn't break anything. She wasn't sure if that was strength or just numbness, but she could work with either. She went to sleep at 2,130 and woke at 445 and did her stretches in the dark and cleaned her rifle and ate and waited. Colonel Richard Mercer arrived at 712 by helicopter, ahead of his own schedule, which was a power move so standard she'd almost expected it. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, built like someone who had kept himself in the kind of shape that said, "I haven't forgotten I'm a soldier rather than I work out." He walked through Fort Blackridge with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been in 100 places like this and understood all of them. He looked at her once, across the compound, before the debrief. Just once, from 30 meters. His expression gave nothing. She gave nothing back. The debrief room was Hale's office, with extra chairs. Mercer took Hale's seat, which displaced Hale to the side of his own desk, which was either thoughtless or deliberate, and she suspected the latter. A captain from brigade, a woman named Ferris, sharp-faced and efficient, sat to Mercer's left with a recording device and a laptop. Mercer opened without preamble. "Let's establish the baseline," he said. "Specialist Vale, your assignment to Fort Blackridge was a standard signals replacement." "That was the stated basis for the assignment," she said. "But not the actual basis." She met his eyes. He had a face that had learned, across decades, to be extremely difficult to read, and she'd had some practice with that type. "I don't know the actual basis. My orders were standard format. The routing was unusual. Unusual how? 2 command levels instead of 1. He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already knew, which she suspected was true. "Lee, walk me through the engagement last night, start to finish." She walked him through it. She was precise and complete, and she included everything: the fire mission, the breach response, Webb's wound, the adjustments she'd gotten wrong before she corrected them. She included those specifically because he would notice if she omitted them, and omissions in Mercer's presence had a way of becoming the primary subject of whatever followed. He listened without interrupting. Captain Ferris typed steadily. When she finished, Mercer was quiet for a moment. "The unauthorized fire mission direction," he said. "Riggs was on the radio. I called the adjustments." "Riggs is qualified to direct fire missions?" "No." "So you directed them?" "Yes, without authorization from the officer in command." Hale had acknowledged the fire plan was active. "The fire plan included the solution coordinates I'd built. The adjustments were real-time corrections to an authorized plan, not a new action." That's a legal interpretation. It's an accurate one." Mercer looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a man deciding how much further to push on a particular point. Then he set it aside. "The strike on the command node," he said. "Walk me through the decision to approach to 50 meters." She walked him through it. Shaw, beside her, added his own account when Mercer asked him directly. Their accounts aligned because they were both accurate, and because they'd talked it through the evening before, not to coordinate stories, but because Shaw wanted to understand the reasoning she'd used, and she owed him that. When they finished, Mercer looked at the patrol report Hale had compiled. He looked at it for a long time. "The command node," he said. Brigade confirms 14 KIA, 2 crew-served weapons destroyed, radio infrastructure eliminated. 2 frequencies went dark simultaneously. He set the report down. That node had been operational for approximately 6 weeks. It was coordinating activity across 4 separate districts. He looked up. We'd been looking for it. The room was quiet. You'd been looking for it, Elena said. Brigade intelligence had a general location window of approximately 20 square kilometers. We'd been trying to narrow it for 5 weeks. He held her gaze. Your grid coordinates reduced that to a single point. She understood several things simultaneously. She let herself understand them in sequence rather than all at once. Because understanding them all at once would have required a reaction she wasn't prepared to display in this room. That's why I was assigned here, she said. Mercer said nothing, which was its own answer. Someone in your command, or someone with access to brigade-level intelligence understood that sending me to this specific phobie at this specific time would put me in proximity to the problem. She watched his face. Because of what I can do, because of how I read terrain and pattern and threat. Specialist veil. And nobody told me, because if I'd known the actual objective, I would have asked questions about authority and method and risk to the soldiers around me, and that would have complicated the timeline. You were given a legitimate assignment. I was used, she said. The word landed flat and factual, not emotional, the same way I was used in Kunar province. Given a position, pointed at a problem, and left to find the solution on my own authority, so that when the question of authorization came up, the answer was she acted without orders. The room had gone very still. Shaw had his arms crossed and his jaw set. Hale was looking at his own desk. Captain Ferris had stopped typing. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. That's a significant accusation, he said. Is it inaccurate? Another pause. Longer. The assignment routing, he said carefully, reflected an operational judgment that your skills were best utilized in this position at this time, without telling me why. The operational security requirements required that I not know I was the actual operation. She kept her voice level, which meant that if I'd been killed last night, the answer to what was she doing there was still signals replacement. Nothing compromising, nothing that required explaining. Mercer looked at her steadily. He had the face of a man who had made hard decisions across a long career and had learned to hold them without apology, which she understood and did not entirely condemn. Hard decisions got made in difficult environments, by imperfect people with limited information, and she knew this because she had been the person making them. But understanding something didn't require accepting it. In Kunar province, she said, I made an unauthorized decision that brought 5 soldiers home. You signed the review that called it a command failure and locked my record. The review was, I'm not asking you to relitigate it. She stopped him cleanly, no heat in it. I'm asking you to tell me whether the person who routed my orders to this FOB was operating with knowledge of what those locked sections say. Whether someone looked at what I did in Kunar and decided it was a feature rather than a flaw. Mercer was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said, one word. She'd asked for honesty, and he'd given it, which she credited him for even as the weight of it settled. Then I need something from you, she said. What? The record. What happened in Kunar, the actual record, not the review. If I was right to do what I did, I need it documented correctly. Not for my career, for the 5 soldiers whose names are in that file and who came home because of a decision that was officially called a failure. Mercer looked at her for what felt like a long time. That requires a formal petition through Colonel. Shaw's voice, cutting across the room. Quiet and hard. With respect. She just found a command node your brigade spent 5 weeks looking for. She held this FOB last night with a defensive plan she built in the dark. She ran a fire mission from a comms tent. He paused. Whatever the paper says happened in Kunar, the paper is wrong. Everybody in this room can see that. Hale said, without looking up from his desk, I'll co-sign the petition. Mercer looked at Hale, then at Shaw, then back at Elena. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated. The look of a man acknowledging a weight he'd been distributing incorrectly. "I'll review the Kunar file personally," he said, "and I'll provide a formal assessment to the review board." "Not a recommendation," she said. "An assessment of the operational record. What was decided and what was accomplished." "Yes." She held his eyes for a moment to confirm he meant it. He met the look without flinching, which was as close to a guarantee as this kind of conversation produced. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without qualification. Mercer stood, and the room shifted with him, the formality of rank reasserting itself. He picked up the patrol report and the engagement summary and tucked them under his arm. "The FOB's defensive posture will be upgraded before I leave today," he said, addressing Hale now. "Additional personnel, resupply, and an intelligence officer attached from brigade." He paused at the door. "The comms equipment that was transmitting brigade forensics will have a full trace within 72 hours. When we have a source, we'll move on it." He left. Captain Ferris gathered her equipment and followed. The room was quiet for a moment. Okafor, who had been sitting in the back corner and had not spoken once during the entire debrief, said, "Was that good or bad?" "Both," Shaw said. Elena looked at the door where Mercer had gone. She thought about the locked file and the 5 names and the mountain in Kunar province and the specific weight she'd been carrying for 3 years. It wasn't gone. It didn't work. Like that things didn't disappear because someone acknowledged them. But the shape of it had changed. "Vale," Hale said. She looked at him, for what it's worth. He stopped. Started again. "I read the recommendation in your file. The one suggesting this assignment. It said you were the best option for this position." He paused. "It didn't mention why. I should have asked harder questions about why." She looked at him for a moment. "You acted on the information you had," she said. "That's all anyone can do. You held this base. We held this base." He accepted that correction, which she noted. She stood and picked up her notebook from the chair beside her and walked out of the room and into the flat afternoon light of Fort Blackridge, which was still damaged and still partially held together with provisional sandbags and still running on a generator that ground like it had given up on everything except survival. She walked to the comms tent and sat at the primary console and put her headset on and looked at the equipment. In front of her, the legitimate equipment now, all of it logged and verified, and ran her afternoon checks. Her hands were steady. That was something. Outside, she could hear the sound of the additional personnel. Mercer had promised beginning to arrive voices, equipment noise, the particular organized commotion of a base accepting reinforcement. The OB getting larger, stronger, harder to crack than the version the assault element had tested last night. It was going to be all right, not perfect. Nothing about any of this was perfect. And the wound in Webb's shoulder and the gap in the northern wall and the exhaustion in every face she'd seen today made that clear. But it was going to be all right. She ran her checks, and the frequencies were clean, and the desert beyond the wire was quiet, and she breathed. The frequencies were clean, and the desert beyond the wire was quiet, and she breathed. That lasted 4 days. The brigade forensics team arrived 36 hours after Mercer's helicopter lifted off, 2 specialists in a vehicle that smelled like solvents and cold electronics. They took the bag transmitters from Shaw's footlocker without much conversation and ran their initial analysis in the tent while Riggs hovered near the door, trying to look like he wasn't hovering, and had a preliminary result by the following morning. Elena was in the planning room with Hale when the lead forensic specialist, a warrant officer named Voss, came in and set a printed sheet on the table. The transmitters were running on a modified civilian frequency, the kind of modification that requires specific technical knowledge and access to parts that aren't standard military issue. They were installed cleanly, no tool marks that would have flagged a visual inspection. Voss had the flat, efficient delivery of someone who worked with evidence for a living and had learned not to editorialize. The signal was encrypted at a level that correlates to a specific equipment package. We've seen that package before. Where? Hale said. Twice. Both times in connection with a logistics contractor operating in this province. Voss set a second sheet down. The contractor had resupply access to 7 FOBs in this sector over the past 4 months, including this one. Access logs put a contractor vehicle at Fort Blackridge on the same day the transmitters were installed. Elena looked at the sheets. The contractor's name: Meridian Tactical Supply. Brigade has already frozen their access credentials and alerted the other 6 FOBs. Voss paused. The individual who signed the access log for that resupply visit is a contracted logistics coordinator named Harlan Price. He's currently not at any of his registered addresses. He ran, Hale said, 3 days ago. Before we started pulling the thread, Voss picked up the sheets. Brigade has a warrant. It's a federal matter now, out of our hands operationally, but they'll find him. He left. The room was quiet for a moment. Price, Hale said. He said it like he was testing whether he'd heard the name before. Did anyone here know him? He signed in twice during the period I've been here, Elena said. I didn't interact with him directly. Riggs did. I'll talk to Riggs. She nodded. She was looking at the space on the table where the sheets had been, thinking about 6 other Everburn fobs and the data that had been flowing out of all of them, and the picture that data would have built over 4 months for whoever was receiving it. The command node she'd found in the bowl was part of something larger. The strike had taken out one node. The network it connected to was still out there, probably reconfiguring around the loss. That was Brigade's problem now. She understood that, and she understood why, and she was trying to decide if she agreed with it. Vale, Hale said. She looked at him. It's Brigade's problem now, he said, reading her expression with the accuracy of someone who had been watching her face for 2 weeks and had gotten better at it. I need you to let it be Brigade's problem. I know. Do you? She looked at him steadily. Yes, I know how this works. He held the look for a moment, then nodded and looked down at his own notes. She walked out. The additional personnel Mercer had sent were settling into the FOB's rhythms by the 3rd day, which changed the texture of the place in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. More bodies meant more noise, more competition for equipment, more variables in the patrol schedule. It also meant that the defensive gaps she'd identified in the FOB's coverage were properly filled with the right equipment in the right positions, which was something she'd been looking at since day one and had been unable to fix with the personnel available before. She ran the comms section with Riggs and the newly attached intelligence officer, a first lieutenant named Park, who was 25 and had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had received good training for a different situation than the one she'd arrived in. Elena gave Park 3 days of what she privately thought of as remedial real-world orientation, the gap between how things looked in the doctrine and how they functioned in actual terrain. The specific ways communication broke down under pressure, the habit of verifying everything twice before relying on it operationally. Park was sharp. She absorbed it fast and without defensiveness, which was rarer than it should have been. How do you know all of this? Park said on the 3rd day, working through the frequencies management protocol Elena had restructured for the FOB's actual needs rather than the standard template. Experience, Elena said. What kind of experience? Because this isn't signals doctrine. It's signals doctrine plus what happens when signals doctrine meets a real environment. She adjusted the squelch on the secondary console. The doctrine is written by people who've thought hard about the problem. The protocol is what you build when you've run it a few times and found out what the doctrine got wrong. Park looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression of someone who had been around enough to recognize the difference between someone performing expertise and someone who actually had it. You should be teaching this, Park said. Elena didn't answer that. She handed Park the frequency log and told her to run the afternoon checks. The call came on day 11. She was in her bunk room, Writing in her notebook, not anything operational, just the kind of writing that served as maintenance for a mind that had been running hard for 2 weeks when Shaw knocked on the doorframe. He had his neutral face on, which meant either something routine or something significant, because Shaw's neutral face covered a wider range than most people's. "Mercer wants you on a call," he said. 20 minutes. Hale's office. She set the notebook down. "What kind of call?" "The kind where you should probably not look like you've been writing in a notebook for the past hour." She changed her shirt and followed him. Hale was already in his office when they arrived, standing rather than sitting, which meant he'd been waiting long enough to get restless. The screen on his desk showed a video call interface, active, but with the camera off on the remote end. At 1400, exactly. The remote camera came on. Mercer was at a desk she didn't recognize, not his usual office, somewhere more formal. There was another person partially visible at the edge of the frame, a civilian, she thought, or someone in civilian clothes. She filed that and waited. "Specialist Vale," Mercer said. "I'm going to make this direct. Please. The Kunar file has been reviewed formally by the board with the operational record restored to its complete state." He paused, and she heard the weight of the pause, not theatrical, but the real weight of a man delivering something he'd had to push to deliver. "The board's finding is that your decision during Operation Coldwater was within the operational parameters of the situation as it existed at the time of the decision, and that the outcome 5 personnel recovered represents the correct result of that decision." She sat very still. "The original review that characterized it as a command failure has been annotated," Mercer continued. "Not expunged, annotated. The record will reflect both the original finding and the board's current assessment." "Why not expunged?" she said. "Because expungement requires a different level of authority than I currently have, and pursuing it would take time that I think you'd rather spend doing something else. The annotation is enforceable and permanent. Anyone who reads your file from this point forward reads both documents." She thought about that. It wasn't what she'd asked for. It was closer to what she'd hoped for than she'd let herself expect. "All right," she said. Additionally, Mercer said, "The assignment to Fort Blackridge, the method of it, the routing, the operational objective that wasn't disclosed to you." He looked directly into the camera, which on her end felt like eye contact, and she suspected was meant to. "That decision was made above my level, and I was aware of it and did not object to it at the time. That was wrong. I'm telling you that directly, because you're owed it directly." The room was very quiet. Shaw, to her left, was looking at the screen with his arms crossed, and his jaw set the posture of a man who was satisfied that something was being said, but was reserving judgment on whether it was enough. "I appreciate that," Elena said. She meant it in the limited way that she could mean it, not forgiveness, not absolution, just acknowledgement that the honesty cost him something, and she recognized the cost. "There's a third matter," Mercer said, "and this one is your decision, not mine." He shifted slightly. Standing up a new advisory element, small, mobile, attached to forward units in this sector. The function is threat pattern analysis, defensive preparation assessment, and the specific kind of reconnaissance work that doesn't fit neatly into existing role descriptions. He paused. "The element needs a primary analyst with field capability, someone who can read terrain and pattern and threat the way you do, and who can operate in environments where the formal role description and the actual job are different documents." She looked at him. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you the job you've actually been doing, with the correct title, the correct authority, and the correct record behind it." "What rank?" "Staff Sergeant. Effective immediately pending your acceptance." She absorbed that. Staff Sergeant was 2 grades above where she was sitting. It was also the grade she'd held before Kunar, before the review, before 3 years of Signal's tents and protein bars, and the specific loneliness of being competent in a role that didn't fit. "I have conditions," she said. Mercer to his credit, didn't look surprised. I expected you would. The personnel I work with are told the actual mission objective before deployment. Not after. Not in retrospect. She held his eyes on the screen. I don't operate in environments where the people around me are at risk because they don't know why they're there. Agreed. I have direct communication access to the officer of command for any unit I'm embedded with. Not through an intermediary, not through a chain that can be delayed direct. Agreed. And if I assess a situation as operationally compromised internal security risk, bad intelligence, command judgment that I believe is going to get people killed, I have the documented authority to flag it up the chain without it being classified as insubordination. Mercer was quiet for a moment. That one cost more. She could see him working through the implications of it. That authority exists within established whistleblower protections, he said finally. I can document its application to your specific assignment. That's what I'm asking for. Then yes. He looked at her steadily. Are there other conditions? She thought about it. She thought about the notebook in her bunk room and the 5 names that were now correctly documented, and the 3 years she'd spent in positions that fit badly, and the 14 people who were alive because a fire plan had been built in the dark, on loose shale in a wadi that nobody had thought to prepare. No, she said. Those are the conditions. Then I'll have the paperwork moving by end of day. He paused once more. Vale, what you did here, the pattern analysis, the defensive preparation, the command node, that work matters. It's going to matter in ways you won't always see directly. He said it without decoration. Factual rather than inspiring. I want you to know that I know that. I know, she said. That's not why I did it. He accepted that. The call ended. The office was quiet for a moment. Hale said, from the corner where he'd been standing throughout, Staff Sergeant. Yes, took them long enough. She looked at him. He said it with the dry delivery of a man who had seen enough institutional machinery to have lost patience with its pace, and it was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him since she'd arrived. She almost smiled. Almost. Congratulations, Shaw said from her left. He said it in the specific way he said things that he meant entirely, without decoration, which meant it landed more accurately than most congratulations she'd received in her life. Don't, she said. Don't what? Make it bigger than it is. I'm not making it anything. I'm saying congratulations. It's one word. She looked at him for a moment. Zin looked, then she looked at Hale and at the now dark screen and at the plywood desk and the buzzing overhead light and the scratched walls of a room that had been a storage closet before it was an office. I need to tell Riggs and Park before the news travels through the base the wrong way, she said. It already has, Hale said. Okafor saw Shaw come get you. Of course he did. She walked out. Okafor was outside, leaning against the wall with the studied casualness of someone who had definitely not been waiting. He took one look at her face and broke into the gap-toothed grin. Staff Sergeant, he said. How did you— Shaw had a look. Shaw always has a look. Yeah, but this one was different. He fell into step beside her, uninvited and not unwelcome. So what happens now? You go somewhere else, or new assignment? Different role. Here no. Mobile. Wherever they need it. He nodded, processing that. They walked in silence for a moment, crossing the compound in the afternoon light, past the repaired northern wall and the antenna array and the motor pool where 2 vehicles were getting routine maintenance by soldiers who had no idea what had just happened in Hale's office and were going about their day accordingly. You're going to be good at it, Okafor said. I've been doing it for a while. Yeah, but now you get to do it as yourself. He shrugged, the loose shrug of a 22-year-old who had not yet learned to hide when he was being perceptive. That's different. She looked at him sideways. He was right. She didn't tell him he was right because he was already walking away, heading back toward whatever he'd been doing before he'd positioned himself outside Hale's office to intercept the news. She kept walking. She found Webb in the aid station, sitting on the edge of a cot with his arm in a sling and a card game spread on the blanket in front of him, solitaire, which he was losing to himself. His shoulder wound was healing cleanly. The medic had told him he'd have full mobility within 6 weeks and a scar for the rest of his life, which Webb had received as neutral information. She pulled a chair over and sat without asking. He looked at her and then at her collar insignia, which still showed specialist rank because the paperwork hadn't moved yet. Heard something's changing, he said. Where'd you hear that? Okafor. She looked at the card game. How's the shoulder? Hurts less than yesterday. Still more than I'd like. He moved a card, then moved it back. You're leaving. New assignment. Yeah. He looked at his cards. You know what's funny? When you first got here, I had you figured out in about 30 seconds. Desk soldier, and over her head, Shaw was going to have to babysit her for a month. He paused. I was wrong about basically every part of that. You were wrong about the desk part, she said. The rest was reasonable given what you knew. I knew you were quiet. I took quiet for absent. A lot of people do. He moved a card. Left it this time. Thing is, when you told me to hold pressure on my shoulder in the middle of the breach, everything going sideways, you said it like it was already handled. Like the fact that I was going to be okay was just a thing you'd already decided and were informing me of. He looked up at her. I believed you. Immediately. Didn't even question it. She looked at him. That's a thing, he said. That's not nothing. You held the pressure, she said. That's also not nothing. He looked back at his cards. Take care of yourself out there. Wherever they send you. You too. She left him to his losing card game and walked back out into the compound and stood in the afternoon light for a moment, looking at Fort Blackridge in its repaired and reinforced and still imperfect state, the wall that had been breached and rebuilt, the antenna array, the comms tent where Riggs was probably running his afternoon checks with the new protocol she'd written, the planning room where a map still had her handwriting in the margins. She'd been here 23 days. It felt longer and shorter simultaneously, the way significant time always did. She spent her last 2 days at Fort Blackridge, completing the transition documentation. The comms protocols handed to Park, with full written notes, the equipment audit finalized and filed. The defensive fire plans updated with the post-assault terrain assessment. She did it thoroughly, not because anyone required it, but because the people staying here deserved to inherit complete work rather than a gap where she'd been. On the last evening, Shaw found her at the cleaning station again. Same table, same position. She'd cleaned her rifle already. It was more habit than necessity and was sitting with it across her lap, looking at nothing in particular. He sat across from her, the same chair he'd pulled over the first time, 2.5 weeks ago, when he'd told her he wanted the real version of who she was. You squared away? He said. Yes. Park has everything she needs? Everything I could give her. The rest, she'll build herself. She's good. He nodded. He looked at the rifle across her lap. You remember what I said first night? About being responsible for you coming back? Yes. I meant it in the field. He paused. I also mean it in general. Whatever they send you into next, be careful. Not careful like cautious. Careful like you matter. Because you do, and you don't always act like you know that. She looked at him. He said it the way. He said everything flat and direct without wanting a particular response, just stating a thing he'd decided needed stating. I know, she said. Do you? She thought about it honestly, rather than answering reflexively. I'm working on it. That's the right answer, he said. He stood and put the chair back against the wall. The debrief record is going to brigade tomorrow. Your analysis, the fire solutions, the node strike, all of it, credited correctly. Thank you. I didn't do anything. Hale pushed for it. She filed that upward revision of Hale, which brought him to a final assessment considerably above where she'd started. Tell him, she said. Tell him what? That I noticed. She stood and slung her rifle. Officers don't always hear that they did something right. It matters. Shaw looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "I'll tell him," he said. She walked to the door, stopped. "Shaw, for what it's worth, you're good at this. The whole thing, not just the field." He looked at her. "The way you hold a unit together when the information is bad and the situation is worse and people are scared. That's the harder skill." She held his eyes for a moment. "It's worth more than the shooting." He was quiet for a moment. "Then go get some sleep, Vale." She went. The helicopter came at 600. She had her ruck packed and her rifle cased and her notebook in her breast pocket. She did a final walk of the comms tent equipment, all logged, all present, all running within spec. She looked at the console where she'd run the fire mission, and the chair where Riggs had been sitting, and the two empty mounting brackets where the transmitters had been, and were not anymore. She walked out. Okafor and Torres were at the landing zone, officially because they were on morning perimeter rotation, unofficially because they were there to see her off. She shook hands with Torres, which he accepted with the serious nod of a young soldier who understood that some moments required a certain register. Okafor did not shake hands. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Don't forget where we are." She looked at him. "On the map," he said. "Don't forget we're here." "I know where you are," she said. "Okay." He stepped back. "Good luck, Sergeant." The rank landed differently from his mouth than it had from Mercer's, smaller and more real. The way rank always sounded when it came from someone who had seen you in the actual dark rather than in a formal context. She picked up her ruck and walked to the helicopter. It lifted at 614, and Fort Blackridge fell away below her HESCO and sandbag and repaired wall, and the comms tent antenna and the western wadi, where the prepared position still sat in the shale, and the eastern ridge where she'd made the first shot, and the bowl formation 4 kilometers southwest, where the smoke had long since cleared and the ground was a different color now than it had been before. She looked at it until the terrain folded around it and it was gone. Then she turned forward and looked at where she was going, which was a logistics hub 40 kilometers east, where her new assignment paperwork was waiting, and a transport would take her to the first of what would be several locations she hadn't been briefed on yet. She was not afraid of locations she hadn't been briefed on. She had learned, across enough of them, that the location was never the point. The point was what you did when you got there and who you were when you arrived and whether you were willing to be fully that person regardless of what the role description said. She was 31 years old. She had a scar on her left forearm from a fragment she'd never had properly treated and a firing pin technique she'd learned from a weapons instructor in a place she wasn't supposed to talk about, and a small notebook full of observations that had turned out to matter. She had 5 names in a file that now told the correct story about what those names meant. She had a rank that reflected what she'd actually been doing for the past 3 years instead of what she'd been assigned to pretend to be. She was not whole. She didn't expect to be whole. Whole was a condition for people who hadn't made the decisions she'd made, and she'd accepted long ago that she wasn't one of those people. But she was here, in a helicopter, over the Afghan desert in the early morning light, going somewhere new, and the file that had buried her was annotated correctly now, and the people at Fort Blackridge were safer than they'd been 23 days ago, and Webb's shoulder was healing, and Okafor would be fine, and Riggs was going to run better equipment audits from now on. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. The helicopter flew east. The sun came up behind it, throwing the shadow of the aircraft long across the desert floor, running ahead of them across the shale and the dry riverbeds and the broken terrain that went on in every direction as far as the eye could follow. She settled at Sincite solidly, professionally, eased into her seat and opened her notebook and began writing down what she'd need to know for the next assignment, which she didn't have details on yet, and which would have its own terrain and its own people and its own set of problems that were different from the last ones in specifics and similar in structure. She was ready for it, not because she had all the answers she'd learned. At considerable cost, The particular danger of people who believed they had all the answers. But because she'd learned something more durable than answers, how to walk into an unknown place, read what was real, act on what mattered, and still be standing when the smoke cleared. That was the skill, not the shot, not the fire mission, not the tactical analysis. The skill was the refusal to become small when everything around you was trying to make you smaller. She had been underestimated in every room she'd ever walked into. She had been buried under paperwork and reclassification and the institutional preference for silence. She had spent 3 years in a role that fit her, the way borrowed clothes fit technically wearable, obviously wrong. And she had held a forward operating base in the Afghan desert with a fire plan she built in the dark and a map she'd marked up in the margins and 14 people who'd followed her, not because they were ordered to, but because. When the moment came, they could see what she saw. That was who she was. Staff Sergeant Elena Vale, the quiet one, the one they'd underestimated, the one they wouldn't underestimate again. The helicopter carried her east, into the light, into whatever came next, and she was not afraid of it. She had never been afraid of the next thing. She had only ever been afraid of becoming the version of herself that stopped trying to find it. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one who has been underestimated long enough to understand exactly what that cost them, and who has decided never to pay it again.